This morning we're going to be talking about efficiencies and best practices for grain dryer owners. This is some results of some work that's come out of a survey that was done this summer, talking to grain dryer owners and operators and elevators across Ontario to understand what their facilities look like. What are the things that are important to them? What types of equipment are they using? That sort of thing. Found some really interesting things that we wanted to share with you this morning. If you've got questions, we are going to be live in the chat, so please type your questions in there and we'll do our best to answer. Our contact information is also at the end of the slide, and you can get in touch with us afterwards, and we'd be very happy to try and answer any questions you might have. My name is James Dick, and I'm the Engineering Specialist for Crop Systems and Environment with the Ministry of Agriculture, Food and Rural Affairs. Joining me this morning is my colleague, Dr. David Lubitz. He's an Associate Professor of Environmental Engineering at the University of Guelph, and he's the lead researcher on this project. And I'll turn it over to Dave to introduce himself and take it from here.
Thanks, James. I'm David Lubitz. I am faculty at the School of Engineering at the University of Guelph, and along with James, been working on things related to grain drying for quite some time. For this presentation, I'll just take you through what we're going to do. First, we'll give you a bit of an overview and some context about the project we've been working on and some of the information about grain production and drying in Ontario that we do know. We'll also lead you through why we ended up doing a survey. We'll talk about some of the results of that survey. There were some interesting findings that came out that I think the community will find relevant. We'll also go over some ways to make sure your drying operation is as efficient and productive as possible. So we'll talk about some of the ways to achieve that, some of the best practices. And we'll give a bit of a summary of what we're planning to do next and where this project is going that we're working on. Finally, we'll have some time for some questions at the end. We'll start with just an overview of this project we've worked on and why we needed to do a survey. The plot up here on the screen, just to set some context, is OMAFRA data that is typical costs to produce corn in Ontario and the different aspects in terms of costs that go into that production. And you'll see that drying is the third largest cost typically in producing corn in this province. So it's a significant part of the process, not only in terms of equipment and the effort and so forth involved, but in terms of the cost as well. Our goals, as we were looking into doing research on dryers in Ontario, is first to understand the picture of how grain is dried in Ontario. There's a lot of knowledge in the community about how grain is dried, how dryers are operated. I would expect a lot of this audience has a lot of knowledge about that already. But what we don't have, either at OMAFRA or any other level of government, or even from the producer groups or any other source, is a big picture of drying in Ontario. How many dryers are out there? What types are they? How much are they utilized? What's the geographic distribution? What are the concerns of dryer operators? That is pretty much an unknown, except to the dryer operators themselves. We also want to create the context, literally gather the foundation information we need for a project we're doing on noise emissions from grain dryers. There's no information on this available either. And so we're looking at going out and taking a set of measurements and actually putting some numbers on this, which we think will be an asset to both planners as well as the community itself. Because right now the amount of noise produced by a grain dryer is an unknown. But in order to plan that experiment, we needed to have a picture of what drying looked like in Ontario. And that just wasn't available. So again, just to reiterate, there's a lack of knowledge. We know drying is important. And finally, we want to find opportunities, particularly the times we're living in now. The carbon taxes that have been coming in have particularly increased awareness of this. It's a good time to be looking for ways to increase efficiency to get more drying with less fuel or less operating costs. Whether that's through changing current practices with the existing equipment you have. Is there a way to optimize drying schedules, drying methods, throughput, things like that? Or potentially are there openings for new technology? Maybe we can shift to different fuel types or different ways of doing things that might allow us to increase efficiency and, very importantly, drive down costs while still providing the drying services that are needed to produce grain in Ontario.
So let's talk for a minute about what we already know before we get into the survey data. One of the things we know is how much grain storage is installed on farm. Not drying capacity, but storage capacity. This comes out of Stats Canada, their field crop reporting series. They call up thousands of farmers every year, and this is one of the questions they ask. You'll notice there's a bit of variability in the data. I think that just means they don't call the same farmers all the time. It doesn't mean we've lost storage capacity. But I think the trend in general is stable. So, and that trend is about 20 million bushels or so of storage capacity every year being added. Now that is the on-farm number. It doesn't represent commercial elevators. For that number, we have to go to Agricor. They do track that through their elevator licensing program, and that number currently is somewhere around 260 million bushels. So you add those together, we get somewhere around 720 million bushels of installed permanent storage capacity in Ontario today. Now, when we look at grain production numbers, that number is sitting around 600 million bushels and has for the last 5 years or so, broken down kind of with the crops as you see. That's good. It means that we've got more storage capacity in Ontario than we grow crops, so we're able to store everything we grow. That's positive. It doesn't tell us much about drying though, so we have to make some assumptions. Now, when it comes to corn, we kind of assume that pretty much 100% of that grain is going to be dried, maybe a little less, but we're growing long season hybrids. They come off the field wet. Even if they're dried just a few points, it still probably goes through a dryer. Soybeans, a lot of that, again, it's late fall harvest. Some of it may come off dry, but there's still a lot that does go through a dryer. Wheat, by contrast, gets harvested in the middle of summer. So most of that is quite dry already, and some of it may pass through the dryer. But that is a good strategy if you're seeing something like disease or sprouting crop up in wheat. Get your crop off a couple of weeks earlier. If it's physiologically mature, just not quite dry, you can take those points down in a dryer and save yourself some quality loss in the field. So in general, I think we're expecting that somewhere around 450 to 500 million bushels of drying happens in Ontario every year. It's a very ballpark number, but it kind of gives us a sense of how much grain we're actually dealing with every year through a grain dryer.
So at this point, it's worth remembering what we don't know about drying in Ontario. For example, we know that lots of different types of dryers are used in Ontario, but we don't know which are the common types, which are the most used. We don't know the geographic distribution of those dryers. We might assume it will be similar to the distribution of grain production in Ontario. The most dryers will be where the most grain is produced. But we don't have any data on that, particularly by, again, type of dryer. We don't have any numbers for how much grain is dried on farms versus how much is dried commercially at elevators. And we know that capacity for that is changing, at least anecdotally, but beyond that, we don't have any numbers on that at all. We also don't know what proportion of dryers are fueled by propane versus natural gas, or sort of the trends on where that's going. Another important thing we don't know is the concerns of dryer operators. Like as a community, what keeps dryer operators in Ontario up at night? I mean, we have talked to individuals, we anecdotally know some things, but we've never sort of confirmed if those are representative of the whole province. Another thing that's particularly of interest, dryers are very long-lived equipment. And we don't know the ages of dryers in Ontario. How old are they? And what are plans for upgrading or replacing them? Again, we might know from individuals, but we don't have a big picture of the whole province. This lack of information and the ability to form this picture led us to design a survey and try and get that information. And we took a two-pronged approach to this. First, we made direct phone calls. We called commercial elevator operators, and we also called equipment dealers. For this, we made use of the fact that commercial elevators are licensed, and so you can get an overall list of all the commercial elevators in Ontario to work with. And equipment dealers tend to have a very public-facing presence. They want to be able to be reached in order to sell equipment. That's their line of business. We found the phone calls worked very well. Gave us a lot of insight from these groups. And we found these groups were very happy and willing to share their information and give us their input, which we're very pleased about. We also decided to do an online survey, and that was because we knew it was also important to reach farmers. And unlike the elevators or the equipment dealers, it's difficult to find individual farmers and to try and get their opinion. So we decided to take the approach of the online survey. We did open this to all respondents, and in the surveys we'll talk about, we did get responses from both farmers and from elevator operators, and all of that is valuable. We took some time to design this survey to optimize the amount of information we would get, the amount of insight we would get, while also balancing that all the respondents are busy and they only have so much time to actually complete a survey. When the survey was complete, some industry organizations, GFO, OABA, OSCIA in particular, were very helpful in publicizing the availability of our survey, getting the word out so that we get respondents to the survey. So it was publicized through the mailings of all these organizations, plus OMAFRA's Field Crop News. And in the discussion that follows, we'll mostly be talking about the online survey. So we're next going to talk about the response we got to the online survey. And as I noted, we got responses from both commercial elevator operators and from farmers, which we were very pleased about. With the elevators, we know there are almost 400 licensed elevator sites in Ontario. Comparison, we had 32 elevator operators respond to us. And the reason we're noting this is a lot of operators operate more than one site. Some have just one or two. There are some cases of a single operator, though, having more than a dozen sites in Ontario. There's some very large operations. Briefly, the average per operation for the number of dryers was almost 2. Again, some sites have a single dryer. What we often found was if there were many dryers in an operation, typically there were only one or a few per site. We also found that per operation, we were looking at a scale of almost 1.5 million bushels dried per operation. And again, that can be covering multiple sites. In terms of the farmers, we had 49 farmers respond to the survey. Grain Farmers of Ontario gives a number of 28,000 grain farmers in Ontario. And we will note that many of those would not have a dryer on site. And our survey was specifically asking for dryer operators to complete the survey. So that's worth remembering. Those respondents that did do the survey, they had 1.1 dryers per farm. So most had a single dryer, but a few had more than one. And they were averaging about 56,000 bushels dried per farm, again per year. So for both the elevators and the farms, you'll notice our response rates are relatively low compared to the total numbers out there. And as we consider the results we're about to talk about next, it is worth remembering that this is relatively low response rates, and it's a sample of opportunity. So We asked people to respond. These are the people who responded. There can be some bias in that. So for example, we have some reason to believe that our farmers overall might have been representing slightly larger than average grain farms.
Now let's talk about dryer types for a minute. We were really interested in knowing what types of dryers are being used on Ontario farms and what that breakdown of types being used looks like. This slide just represents some of the major types that are out there today. I'm not going to go through them in detail because I think, for the most part, they're self-explanatory to anyone who's been around dryers. They kind of go from smallest capacity to largest, and they're not perfect categories. Like a heated bin dryer can also be a batch dryer. A top dry could be batch or continuous, and then a mixed flow and a tower dryer. They're both actually all examples of continuous flow, but these are kind of some of the main categories, and this is what we were curious to know where these were at in terms of Ontario. So if we look at what the survey told us, first of all, the elevators, I don't think it's any surprise that elevators are using a lot of high capacity continuous flow type dryers. They're drying a lot of grain, they're moving a lot of grain. They're not going to bother with some of the smaller batch style dryers. Still a little bit being used, but not a lot. When it comes to farms, definitely a lot more bin dryers being used. Not really a surprise there. It was a little surprising to see the amount of continuous flow is being used on farms. I think that speaks to the size that some of our farms are getting to today, that's become a popular type of dryer. Certainly a higher capacity, high throughput type of situation. I was a little surprised to see top dry where it's at. I thought that might be higher, especially in the on-farm category. Maybe I just have a special place in my heart for top dry because I come from a farm that makes use of it. So anyway, this is what we found from the survey in terms of the numbers of dryers for the responses that we got.
The survey also gave us some interesting insight into the utilization of dryers in Ontario. In the survey, we had asked respondents the total amount of grain that they dried in a year, the total number of bushels. And we had also asked them their drying capacity. How many bushels per hour are your dryers capable of drying? Here, we've taken that data and we've plotted one of those against the other. On the vertical, we have the total amount dried. On the horizontal, we have the drying capacity. And when we plot that, we see some interesting trends. The plot here nicely shows the results for the elevators. And typically, as the amount dried increases, the total dryer capacity also increases. Each of those dots represents a single response. You can tell there's some scatter there, but we can fit a line through them to get an overall insight, which is the dashed blue line for the elevators. And we did a similar thing for the farms. Although in this case, you'll notice the farms are all clustered down in the lower left corner because they're both lower amounts dried and lower capacity than the elevators, of course. So let's zoom in on those farms. We'll see a similar pattern with the farms. What's interesting here is for both the farms and the elevators, we can take this data together and work out how well each was utilizing their dryers. Here's what we found. For every 100,000 bushels of grain that was dried, we found the elevators had a drying capacity of 240 bushels per hour, while the farms had a drying capacity of about twice that, about 500 bushels per hour. This might not be too surprising. A commercial elevator during the drying season is going to make much more use of the dryer day over day, week over week, than a farm is going to be able to do, particularly if the farm is just drying their own production. So perhaps it's not surprising that we found that farms on average have about twice the drying capacity as elevators. And that's mainly reflecting that the elevators, again, more significantly utilize the capacity they do have during the drying season. Another aspect of the survey was that we asked respondents to rate their concerns about a whole range of issues related to dryers. We want to get a feel for, I think as I said before, what keeps dryer operators up at night. So within the survey, we listed this whole series of possible concerns and asked the respondents to rank them from 0, meaning I'm not concerned at all about this, to 10, meaning I'm extremely concerned about this particular thing. What we've done here is we've ordered them by the average amount of concern from top to bottom. And so if you scan down this list, you'll notice that fuel cost increases due to regulation. The carbon taxes that are coming in, I think, are particularly noteworthy right now. Ranked as the highest average concern for both the farms and the elevators. Other fuel-related costs were also important as a source of concern. Cost variability was the second highest after potential cost increases, and other operating costs as well. Some dryer operators also reported concerns related to some of the other aspects we asked about. For example, availability of labor and service for repairs to a dryer or parts, as well as overall maintenance and reliability. The lowest level of concern on average was for dust and noise. And that basically means that for most of our respondents, dust and noise weren't an immediate concern for their operation. Interesting things to note, the blue bars represent the elevators, the orange bars represent the farms, and you'll notice that typically the trends are the same for both. Both elevator operators and farmers reported the same concerns and the same amount of concern overall. The final thing to note, though, is for each of these, I think for every category, we had a few responses that were very concerned, and we had a few responses that would be not concerned at all. So while the averages shift, different dryer operators did have different concerns and different levels of concern. I wouldn't call any of the individual responses similar to all the others. There's a lot of variability out there in the concerns. But overall, we did see some important patterns, and again, particularly around things related to fuel as a source of concern. In the survey, we also asked about type of fuel used in dryers. And here's the results, again divided by elevators and by farms. For our respondents, most of the elevators were using natural gas, perhaps not too surprisingly. While the results for the farms were more mixed. We had a good representation of both natural gas and propane. We do know that natural gas is cheaper than propane if it's available, but in many areas it's not yet available. The other thing we'll sort of note is, in terms of the dryer size, it tended to be the smaller dryers that were on propane, but there were some cases of large dryers on propane, and those were almost exclusively in cases where they needed the drying capacity, but natural gas was just not available in the area. We also did ask specifically about fuel costs. Basically, we asked respondents how much they were paying for fuel. If we divide that by the number of bushels they dried, we get cost per bushel to dry based on fuel type. And I should note, the numbers I put up here are just fuel costs and reported fuel costs for drying. So they don't include other types of operating costs, any other types. This is just fuel. There's some interesting things we see here. One is we're looking on the order of 22, 23 cents per bushel for fuel for propane, while we're looking only on the order of 13 or 14 cents per bushel for natural gas. We expected to see that natural gas would come out cheaper, and indeed it was for our respondents. The other interesting thing to note, though, is that the reported costs were basically the same, whether it was farms or elevators. At least when it comes to fuel costs, it doesn't seem like the larger elevators are getting much of a better deal or able to get some sort of volume discount for their fuels. Um, so.
So we just talked about fuel costs reported in our survey. Let's look at the historical cost of drying from a fuel perspective. What you're seeing on the chart is a representation of what it would cost per bushel to use various fuels of drying over the last 10 years and then projected forward over the next 10. That projection is really just an average of the change that happened over the last 10 years, pushed forward another 10. It's nothing more than that. I just thought it'd be interesting to see what might be possible. Doesn't mean fuel prices won't do something different though. The other thing you'll note is there's a finely dotted line on there that represents the impact of the carbon tax, or rather what the fuel price would be without carbon tax. Obviously, fuel regulation from carbon tax was, by far and away the most pressing concern of all the dryer operators we saw. So I thought you'd be interested in seeing this data. We know that the carbon tax at the moment is about $40 a ton, I believe, and it's set to increase quite a bit over the next 10 years. So this is where we'll be, and as you can see over time, it does become a much more significant portion of the cost of drying grain. Of course, this is cost per bushel, and it's based on some assumptions. So, things like dryer efficiency, the actual weather conditions that you're drying in, the grain moisture is all going to affect your costs. So, yours may not be exactly the same as this. But if we look at what was reported from the survey, you'll see that, compared to our costs in 2020, which is right in the middle of the chart, they're not far off. And that's good. So it means that, the data we got from the survey is reasonably accurate. I should say the red line, this natural gas price comes from the Ontario Energy Board historical prices. The propane price, we don't actually track that really in Ontario on a comprehensive basis. So that's actually the Texas wholesale price is what you're seeing there, converted to Canadian dollars. And I should note these are average annual prices. So it doesn't, if there was a big spike in a couple of months, that's not captured here, or it's averaged out. But these are the average annual prices, just to give you an idea of what, grain drying, from a fuel perspective looks like. Also doesn't factor in overhead costs, capital cost, maintenance, or operating. This is simply drying fuel cost. And I mentioned about drying efficiencies. So when we talk about a dryer efficiency, what we're really talking about is the amount of energy it takes to evaporate a certain quantity of water. Usually we talk in BTUs per pound of water. It's an American unit, but that's what everyone uses. And you can convert that to metric pretty easily. The math is on the chart. But that's what we're talking about. So if you talk to a dryer manufacturer about efficiency, you might hear a number in BTUs per pound of water. That's what it means. The green bars on the chart that you're seeing show the ballpark efficiency on average of some of the major types of grain dryers. The black bar gives you an idea of the cost. Now that's cost per ton. It's not cost per bushel, but it's still gives you an idea based on some fuel cost assumptions you see there. So essentially, you can use this chart so when you talk to a manufacturer, you can kind of understand where their dryer stacks up in terms of kind of what might be expected from the average piece of equipment out there. Of course, the best thing to do is know what your dryer is capable of, because you can't improve something if you don't even know where you're starting from. At the most basic, that means know how much grain you're drying in a year and know what your fuel cost is. And you should try, if you can, to get the fuel cost that's actually only dedicated for your dryer. Because if you've got, say, a barn or a house also on that gas meter, it's going to affect your cost. The way you can account for that is try and pick a month of the year where maybe your fuel usage or rather the temperature outside is similar, but you're not drying grain. So I'm thinking like March and April might be good, comparators to, say, October, November. And you can take the amount you're using in those months, subtract it from your months when you're drying grain, and you can get the actual number that is only dedicated for your grain drying. And you'll just be a lot more accurate then. Of course, if you can extract the cost from it and actually look at the quantity of fuel you're using, that is more accurate again, because cost goes up over time. So probably your cost per bushel is going to go up over time, but it doesn't mean your energy use per bushel has gone up over time. So if you can actually look at the fuel number, that'll give you a more accurate representation. The best thing to do, though, is take that fuel quantity and figure out how many pounds of water are you actually removing from your grain. So to do that, you also need to know the moistures, and then you go to the table on the left-hand side. Your wet grain is in the blue column, your dry grain's in the yellow rows. Match those two up, and the spot on the chart, the number that's there is the pounds of water per bushel that you're actually removing from that grain. So then you take that number, take your fuel usage. You do have to calculate an energy content, so you multiply that by the appropriate factor that I've given you there. Divide that by your water removal and the amount of bushels you're drying. You'll come out with an efficiency number in BTUs per pound of water. And then you know what your own dryer is actually capable of. So when you're talking to a dryer manufacturer and you're asking about efficiency, you can understand whether or not the dryer you're looking at is actually better or worse from an efficiency perspective of what you already have. Of course, buying a new dryer is not the only way to improve your efficiency. There are things you can do operationally. Make sure your dryer is clean, first of all, and make sure the grain's clean. It'll dry more easily. You're removing any blockages from the screens and things like that. And just make sure it's operating well and that it's burning cleanly. Those are all ways to, it does make a difference in terms of the operation of your dryer. If you're set up for it, you can look at something like dry aeration or in-bin cooling, which is basically running your continuous flow dryer at full heat and moving that hot grain straight into a bin and then cooling it down in a bin over about 12 hours instead of 20 minutes in the cooling section in your dryer. The advantage is you're using that residual heat to take the last few points of moisture out. You're saving a bunch of fuel and increasing your dryer throughput as well. The disadvantage is you do need a cooling bin that's set up with a fan large enough to keep up to your dryer, or multiple cooling bins. So it doesn't work for everybody, but it can be a good way to save some fuel. And of course, over drying your grain, you're not getting any benefit there, so don't bother. If you're looking at retrofits for what you have, if you've got a column dryer, you can certainly look at heat recirculation plenums. The reason this works is when it comes to the lower end of that drying column, the grain's almost dry anyway, so the air that's being blown through there, it really hasn't used up much of that heat. So it's still pretty hot. You can easily recirculate that back into the fan and you're getting an efficiency boost that way. The disadvantage is it does become a bit of a maintenance item. You just have to make sure those recirculation areas stay clean, but it's a good way to save some fuel, and you can easily retrofit that on a lot of column dryers that are out there. Something else that might be feasible for you if you've got a heat source nearby, like a generator or something, if there's a way you can dump some of that waste heat into your dryer inlet, that can be a good way. Even a few degrees does make a difference. Of course, again, you can look at a new dryer. Some of the questions to ask, and along with efficiency, things like suction cooling can make a difference. That's where you're drawing air in through the cooling section of the dryer, and you're getting basically preheating the air by doing that, so you don't need as much fuel to get it all the way to plenum temperature. Or staged heating. If you've got a stacked dryer, say with multiple burners, you can set those burners to different temperatures, and then you're not overheating certain plenums when they don't need to be, and you can better manage the temperatures coming across your dryer. So, talk to your manufacturer and see what options are available for the dryer you're looking at. It's also important to know when you're asking them about efficiency, they're often basing it on some assumptions as well. So if you can give them some idea of your own drying conditions, say the outdoor air temperature, the average moistures, things like that, they might be able to give you a better estimate of the efficiency. So make sure you ask those kind of questions as well.
There are also some best practices to reduce dust and noise emissions from your dryer operations. So on the noise side, we do know that site layout can make a big difference. So if you're planning to install a new dryer, you might want to consider its orientation and location relative to the rest of your site, and particularly neighboring land uses or other things. We do know that most of the noise from drying operations, the particularly loud noise, comes from the fans and blowers, and to a lesser extent the burners and so forth, and the grain handling that happens right at the dryer. So in some cases, siting barriers or putting in insulation to locally reduce the sound right near the source can have a fairly substantial effect, especially for noise off property or further away. There are some silencers and some add-ons available for some types of fans and blowers. And if you're looking at upgrading your fan or blower, it is worth noting that some of the new models of those are significantly quieter than some of the older generation. Particularly if you're looking at replacing an old axial flow type fan, you should be able to see some notably reduced noise emissions. In the phone calls, we did have several operators note that their newer dryer, they could have a conversation next to the operating fan, whereas it just wasn't possible with the older equipment. Dust is often another thing that comes up around dryers. And minimizing dust emissions is good both for your neighbors as well as working on site. Yeah. So again, the layout of your site can be important. Prevailing winds, the positioning of different equipment and buildings. An important thing you can do is enclose your receiving and loadout area to basically minimize the spread of that dust. And dust capture technology can be used, so more active equipment. Siting of windbreaks, again, can also help reduce the spread of dust, particularly off-site or beyond the sort of local drying and loading area. And for dust, it's also really important to keep the site as clean as you can. The more fines and dust and so forth laying around, the more likely that is to be picked up by wind or during operations and be resuspended in the air and create a dustier environment. So far we've been talking about our results to date from our survey and the project we've been working on related to grain drying. Here's what's coming up next for us. In terms of the survey, the online survey is still open and we are still collecting more data. And additional data does help improve the accuracy of the results. So if you haven't done the survey yet, please feel free to find the link to that and complete it. We will be compiling the results of that later this fall, and we'll be sharing those results on the Field Crop News and with our industry partners, and we'll be making that available. So we're looking forward to that. We're also going to be working on a noise mitigation project. We're going to be taking experimental measurements at different types of dryer operations. And these measurements are rare. This data is going to be new, and I think it's going to be useful. So we're really looking forward to doing that and seeing how much noise there actually is. And what we're really looking forward to with that is being able to evaluate some different best management practices, the effects of silencers and barriers and things like that, as well as seeing the difference between some of the different types of equipment. We're also, in other things related to dryers, working on energy projects, as in looking at projects to reduce energy use, and we're particularly excited about some projects related to alternate methods of providing the heat for drying that don't rely on propane or natural gas. And we're also looking to develop our virtual models of grain drying that we've been working on. Those are exciting for me because they allow virtual experiments. You don't have to build a prototype to try and see how well, say, a change in operating procedures or a change in technology might impact a drying process. You can do it all virtually in the computer to get an idea if it's worth building those prototypes and trying that out in real life at full scale. So this will wrap up our presentation. And I'd like to conclude by saying thank you to a number of people and organizations that made this possible. First, Kyle Teeter, our great co-op student this summer, who did a lot of the work to actually make the survey and gather this information. And so big shout out to Kyle. I'd also like to thank all the survey participants for their time and being so willing to share their information and their knowledge with us to again make this possible. We couldn't have got the survey out without the help of several organizations: Grain Farmers of Ontario, Ontario Agribusiness Association, and the Ontario Soil and Crop Improvement Association, sharing and publicizing this with their members and through their channels. And so thanks to the people there who helped us out, both with that and with making sure that the survey was as good as it could be. And finally, I'd like to thank Canada's Digital Farm Show for giving us this platform to share all this with you and get the word out. Finally, this research project is funded by the Ontario Ministry of Agriculture, Food and Rural Affairs through the Ontario Agri-Food Innovation Alliance. And that was also an essential part of being able to do all of this. At this point, if you have any questions, we'd be happy to answer them or to try and answer them. Or if you come up with questions later, or you have information you want to share or issues, please don't hesitate to reach out to either myself or James. Our contact information is here. And finally, we thank you for your time today, and we look forward to continuing to work with the drying community going into the future.